Hello, everyone, and welcome to India Foundation for the Arts' Project Showcase Online. As some of you know, India Foundation for the Arts, or IFA, is a nationwide organization. It's independent. It supports and implements projects in the arts and culture across the country, across disciplines, across regions and languages, in arts practice, arts education, and the larger area of arts research, documentation, archives, museums, etc. Over the last 25 years, we've supported and implemented over 680 projects, and the outcomes of these projects as books, productions, archival material, webinars now, digital images are out there for the public, in the public domain, to enrich your lives. Now, another thing that we do other than supporting and implementing projects is ensure that these projects in their different avatars reach you and you're able to see the incredible work that our artists, teachers, and scholars do with the funding that they get. Now, before the pandemic, obviously, we would do these events on site in collaboration with different partners in different cities and towns across the country, where we would actually meet you and hope to also engage with you, have a cup of coffee or chai with you as we together listen to our artists make their presentations, share their work with us. But since March 2020, we decided to make this an online initiative where we engage with you in this manner in our Zoom windows to share this work. Today is very special because today we have a piece of work that is quite rare. It's to do with poetry, and I will leave it to my colleague John to give you a little bit about it. But what I will share is a few ground rules about being on this evening with us. So those of you who are on Zoom, please use the chat box for comments, for suggestions, if you have any ideas or you want to share anything. But if you want to ask our artists today questions, then I would request you to put that in the Q&A box. And at the end of the conversation that our two artists are going to have today, you are going to listen to them respond to your questions. And with that, I will hand this over to John. Oh, yeah, one more thing. Those of you who are watching us on Facebook, you can also ask questions. Just put them as comments on Facebook, and somebody from our team will let us know what those questions are. So enjoy, and John, over to you to introduce our artists and the topic today.
Thank you. Thank you, Arundhati. Can you hear me? So today we have Himali Singh Soin joining us from London to start the evening with a poetry reading, followed by a discussion with Anshika Varma. Himali Singh Soin is a writer and artist based between London and Delhi, and Anshika Varma is a Delhi-based photographer and curator. Himali received an arts practice grant in 2018 from IFA to make this artist book based on her navigational explorations to the polar regions. IFA's arts practice program is to support artists to take on experimental or unprecedented artistic processes. Himali's artistic process involves exploration of nature and bookmaking, along with poetry performances. As we know, colonialism involved mastery of the world and mastery of nature through navigation and bookmaking, as in print capitalism. In her art practice, Himali is using the same tools but differently to offer a counterpoint to colonialism from the subcontinent through her poetry. Please join me in welcoming Himali to read her poem from her artist. Himali, over to you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Arundhati. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for anyone that's listening. Listeners of poetry are a gift in this moment. I will start with the dedication in my book, and it's dedicated to ice. Our elder, our sage, our astrologer, our shaman, our timekeeper, our politician, our philosopher, our teacher, our protector, our folly. To ice, we tell your story. The logbook. This logbook does not know what. This logbook reads its own repetition and yawns. It remembers the days it was hard-backed and crisp-sheeted. Now its creases are memories, the sand and the crystals and a film of rain and daydreaming bruises its pages. It cannot choose to erase parts of its past, even as the lead dulls and forgets. It sighs at its maps, dotted and undecided, or tarmacked and overrun. It longs for the paths that diverge from the road, the trails lined with the pointy plant that drips with therapeutic milk, that the leaves that leave the soil beneath it warm and dry. It does not know how far it has traveled, the persistent kilometers. In fact, it lives resistant to expertise and with its own private politics. It cannot read maps to scale or reorient to decipher direction. It remembers that people read maps in the opposite direction to the one in which the sun sets. But its own north and south is formed from a compass of feeling. This logbook was written by multiple beings: a scientist of high molecular density, her therapist, a landscape painter, an astronaut and an alien, and a carrier pigeon, to mention a few. Nothing contains it, not ancient tablets, not history or biographies or dictionaries or poems. It is a record of speculation. It is an almanac, a cheap dream book, an instruction manual on what to do when measurements become meaningless. This logbook contains no photographs. It invites you to dislocate yourself somewhere else or here. It promises that language can do more. It waits, stares at the blankness like a face in love. In love, its time is unreliable. It is like ice in this. Those are the introductory notes to this very lopsided book. And I invite Anshika to interrogate me.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Himali, for allowing me to come in and put my own thoughts next to yours and maybe find some answers into this deep dive into the core of a new existence in many ways. Thank you so much for reading out from the logbook. And I think it is it's a beautiful manifesto in many ways to what we engage with as we move through the pages of this book. And I think for me, when I read this chapter, this opening for the first time, I also thought about your own engagement as an artist so much in interrogating how we remember, how we move forward, and how we also think about memory and how we think about the senses. Kind of, sorry, can you hear me well? I think my audio is a little bit low, but is
Yeah.
this good? Okay, lovely. So I thought what would be nice for us to begin with in defining the opposites, let's just say, is to start with what is familiar to us and what is the unfamiliar. And specifically, to you as you went on this journey towards two extreme ends of the earth. And I know that the work has had many manifestations, both in the tangible and the experiential. And I thought it would be really beautiful for us to talk about how uh, the beginning of this journey is part of your process. The idea of exploration itself is very central to your practice, and the idea of memory has been central to your practice. And how do you kind of place yourself as this shaman, as this tarot reader, as this decoder of, you know, of a place that has no belonging in many ways. And I think we'll address these elements a little bit more as we go further into the book. And I might ask you to share a little bit more from your readings. But I think I wanted to know what.
Anshika, just a little louder, please. I think your volume is a bit
Okay.
low. If you speak a little louder, that will be fine. Thank you.
No worries. Is this good? Is this much better?
Yes, this is better.
Okay.
This is better.
Lovely.
Yes, thank
Lovely.
you.
Thank you. Sorry. So for those of you who might not have heard much of what I've said up until now, I just thought we'd start this conversation with Himali the explorer in many ways, if I may, and talk about the importance of this journey as you navigate a world which is a place of no belonging, right? Like in many ways, you're going to extremities on this planet that have no history, and yet we do decode this history through you. And you're creating a new language in understanding what this decoding is like. And I thought we'd start from that point and then go maybe into some of the forms that that you used to manifest this exploration.
That's a beautiful question. You know, the question of belonging is super interesting because in a way I went there thinking that, and I went there because of that. In the years before going to the poles, I had been using outer space as my palette. I mean, what better palette for a poet, right? Or so I thought. It's the stars, it's delayed light, it's ideas of long time, love lost, multiple universes occurring at the same time. This was ripe material for me. And going to the poles initially felt like maybe that's how I can go to outer space. It felt like the closest to get to the moon. But then getting out of the boat in the Arctic or in the Antarctic, the first thing I was struck by was that they were not spaces, they were places. In the Arctic, there's obviously a huge indigenous population. In the specific Arctic in which I was, there was no indigenous population. So I thought, okay, but where are the stories? And my guide said, there are no stories, there are no legends here, because there's no tradition of oral storytelling or indigenous people. And I looked out and there was ice everywhere. And you can also see ice breaking so quickly. And I realized that the ice was the elder. Ice was the indigenous being that had such a strong sense of belonging, and like many indigenous cultures all around the world, is at a loss, both of its life and its language. And because it's a non-human entity, I felt like I was being called or summoned to be a medium to tell its story. And that's how it kind of began. So, and then of course, in the Antarctic too, while there is no culture, so to speak, there are these research stations. It's a deeply political and claimed space. And so thinking about who it belongs to is a really interesting question. And this sort of boomeranged me into telling ISIS stories, the feeling of urgency, but also suddenly feeling like an alien myself. I was this completely brown object in a very white landscape.
I was just going to ask you about that, because when you're talking about the politics of being, there's also you who is both visually and, in the form and the method of your research, completely on the opposite end of the spectrum in many ways. And how does that integrate with the being the storyteller for an existence that is also forgotten while it's still there?
I had this really interesting experience in an old, now defunct Soviet town called Pyramiden. And I get there and there's this massive coal mine. And I'm dressed up in my silver costume, this silver, the feeling of both outer spaceness in that silver, but also this material that both reflects and absorbs the landscape. So you have this constant osmosis between yourself and the land. And this is where exploration comes from. That idea of exploration is to decolonize that exploration as thinking of nature as something to be extracted from, but something that possibly could seep into you. So I reached this town and there's this coal mine. And I understand that this coal mine is one of the reasons why the ice is melting. Why, if I have taken on the avatar of ice, the coal mine is the reason for my own destruction. At the same time, its blackness met my brown body, and I felt a friendship in that coal mine. It was the only other dark object in that landscape. And I felt the heat suddenly I became an equatorial being. And I felt the heat that that coal mine could have provided. So the climate change stories in the book are also complicated. They're not as simple as ban fossil fuels. There is a moment where I suddenly think, oh, here is me, and I am destroying myself. You're on mute.
Right. Can you hear me now? I mean, it's interesting that you talk about the otherness in so many ways, because one is the otherness of the body and and the visuality of it, but there's also an otherness of method, right? You're also kind of countering a particular format of research and a particular format of numbers and rigor to a very connected form of it's about collectivizing. It's about kind of finding oneness with where you are, which is very, very separate from the politics that has brought different places into the into the polls as you go there. It's no longer about claiming territory. It's about kind of giving in to that territory, and in that giving in, maybe learning a new language. And I mean, you talk about language a lot as well, in different forms and ways through the book. And I also wanted to kind of, the idea of the tropical that you did, begin to find seeping into your myth making comes in really beautifully, I think, in the story of the Orchid. And it would be really lovely if you could share maybe a little segment of that, and how you and the Orchid in many ways mirrored certain aspects that you were thinking of during that journey.
It was really a landscape where at some point you get there because of precise mathematics, because you've counted all the polar gear that you need to get there, because every minute of the day you're looking at the wind and the temperature. At the same time, suddenly the fog enters and the mist enters and your chronometer starts to error and nobody knows anything anymore. So it became this landscape where truth is just one of many ways of knowing a subject. And so this definitely, the book tries to do this, is to engage with many different forms of knowing, whether it's intuition or not knowing as a way of knowing. And also trying to come up with ideas of embodied knowledges, or entering histories with fiction as another way of truth-telling. Wind and Seed, I think, is the piece that you're referring to. Anshika is going to freestyle on me, just like requesting pieces
just
that now
a little bit
search for. I'm going to look. Wind and Seed actually gets to some of the ideas that you're talking about. I have it now, because it's about this tiny orchid that travels from somewhere in the equator all the way to Antarctica, and it drops with a plop. But this story, I wanted to tell it because it was a real metaphor for me going to these places that sounded to everybody like I was going there. And what I'm trying to say is that I was coming here, that these places are entangled. And sometimes it's by a loose, intangible, invisible thread like wind, dispersing a seed from one place to another. And then something grows elsewhere as a remnant or a proof or a sign that this map is a much more entangled map than we could ever know. So it's called Wind and Seed, and I'll read you the first paragraph. In Arabic, there are maybe a dozen words for love. One of them is hawa, which translates to the beginning of love. In Hindi, hawa means air or wind. There's something in the air. Another one is hub, meaning seed, meaning something that could burst open and bloom. So many words for love. Language helps us find ways to forge new futures. When they come to burn it all, maybe one of the dozen words would escape, fly away like a seed carried by the wind. The seed flew from the Arabian desert to Antarctica, where it dropped with a plop on an iceberg and slept for 1,000 years. To know the rest of the story, you're going to have to read the book.
A little bit of effort, I think, from all of us on that. But what I really loved about Wind and Speed, which is also the first chapter as such, I think, in the book that we encounter, is that it talks about one of what I might assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, is kind of like your primary motivators for work, which is love itself. And it's kind of like, but I want you to kind of expand a little bit on this quest for love, where does it emerge into? There's different bodies of work that have addressed it in different ways. There's different forms of love that Wind and Seed addresses itself, and to love is, it's seeming more and more also a political act in many situations. And so in this search for love, when you find language and when you create language and when you tell stories, I wanted to kind of know, how does one get to know your love? Like, if that helps in any, I don't know if I'm being clear, if I'm not.
I mean, I could talk for hours about love and say nothing. And all of us, as all of us would and could. I think love, it works in a very specific way for me in language. And that, let's call it even desire or a force of attraction. But this is for me a way that something like a woman with an umbrella in the middle of the Alps finds the Paratha Wali Gali in Chandni Chowk. What holds these two stories together? It's some kind of force of attraction. It's the same way we think of multiple universes and what are they connected with. So this idea of love seems abstract, but it's also a way of thinking about loss. It's a way of thinking about gaps and thinking about distance as love. So the same thing that holds two things apart could possibly hold two things together. And then that becomes political, right? Especially in this current moment for us in India.
More so. And I think it's this kind of sensorial understanding of place that we carry within us at all points, right? That's what activates memory in so many different ways at so many different places. That's also what we're, and where does that lead to is somewhere where maybe Bothness comes into that to a certain degree, where you're talking about this sense of time that's just surrounding us, and in the macro and the micro-ness of looking at each other, you find kind of a larger understanding of the world, and through that maybe of who we are and what our desires might be. And I know that Bothness is something that you are. For me, it kind of becomes like how the power of language leads to experiments with the self and on the self in many instances. This steering of love to stay in many ways, or to let go of it even, and I wanted to know if maybe we could have one more tiny excerpt that might lead to an understanding of not the love in the very literal way, but in this idea of looking at what you see and finding the fantastical in it, which is a fair bit of your entire journey, if I may say so.
Yeah, and in a way, we're also talking about intuition, love as a critical modality. Replace science or reason with love and see what happens. So maybe I could read just a little bit of Bothness. Bothness feels to me like a manifesto about using intuition as a method, because it was this moment where suddenly we were on the boat and everything stopped working. And we had to figure out the way that we would find direction. And the captain decided to show us the parts of the ship so that we could all take on roles and start to lead the ship.
Wow.
Called Bothness. There is nothing to tell us that time has passed. The sky has not shifted, no shafts of sun, no heat, no dead darkness. We have become the sway of the boat, the whimsy of the wind in the sails, the squeak of the wood and the rope against the steer, the autopilot correcting the bunt, the binoculars, the charcoal smudged coastline. The captain is explaining the parts of the ship by drawing the ship on the deck in chalk. Meta is not even the word here, the boatness of the boat. We wait for Theseus. Is the drawing of the ship on the deck of the ship now part of the ship? The surface part of the sea, chalk part of chalk, part of the assembly of the ship, part of the time of the ship, part of the analog mountain pixelated in the water, part of the premonition, part of the rhythm of the ship, she, the rhythm of the body, the adjustment of the body, the adjustment of the ship, histories erased by white, histories that never occurred, the failed experiments, the evaporating permafrost, the closed mines, the fallen balloons, the last shipment, the flooded seed bank, all conducted by clocks that do not know their part in it. The drawing of the ship on the deck of the ship is, therefore, an ocean in the ocean, the diagram of an eclipse, an S that needs only an apostrophe to plural, the myopic astronomer, all the while knowing that to draw a ship on the deck of the ship is to see the whole in a part, in the way that we can see the galaxy even as we are inside the galaxy. The boat is after the ark. It can tell big things from far away, as if it always saw love coming. The strong post of the eye, the fragile bend of the T. Love breaking, as if it knew it had made a promise it could not keep, like inviting a rich guest for a dinner of bones. Like playing the triangle in an orchestra, like sex after sex, Love like seaweed, unbodied and muscular, seaweed like old cables uprooted by the elements, like antennas still sending tired messages at listless frequencies and amplitudes like anthills. Data suddenly poems. Then what? Electricity, light through the thickness of water gushing through the deck of the ship. The drawing has been erased. Only mast and moonraker left to steer the whole hull. This is maybe how love feels. Seaweed in the ocean, seething between shore and shallows, disembodied, arms and legs and eyes everywhere, sinking and drifting. Sending missives to the gridded world, saying, where are the bounds of what you can only sense? Bothness is the thing that sustains till the new love comes. That ellipses between love and love over and over.
Thank you for that. I have to say, although you do mention even in the book that this book has no photographs, I think there's a small portion where it comes. For me, this is one of the most visual books that I have engaged with. And I think it is in how you evoke what you are seeing, but you're creating a language about that visuality that is connecting with us on a much deeper level, that moves away from the rules and the formats in which we engage. And I know that that's something that's very important for your practice as well. I mean, the book addresses the doing away of rules, almost like an act of resistance, right? And I mean, what's interesting is that there's also so many references to mythologies from across the world, where at one moment we're kind of in one timeline with one particular civilization, we're existing in the Arab universe, and then we move completely to a different time and space. We're in probably a Victorian age trying to, deal with what this whiteness claiming territory is going to be like. And in this mix of kind of history and mythology and the negation of it, there is a lot about the global south and its own history that kind of comes in. And that, I mean, for me, that was actually a very, very important aspect in being able to visualize what you're also writing. And I thought that was something that it reads very naturally in so many ways. But of course, that process is not so intuitive in many ways. It's an intuition that you still build. And to believe in that intuition means to defy the rules that have been kind of placed for our cultural and social setups. And I wanted to talk to you about what it means to have that practice translated into a very tangible form. It's kind of like you said, it's a manifesto in many ways of saying you can dream in your own language, you can view in your own language. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the book form that emerged from that, and why the book became so important for you for this particular work. I know that you have videos around it, and there's performative elements. It goes through a wide range of practices. For me, the book was a point of curiosity as well. So if you could talk about that, that would be really interesting.
Thank you. I could just listen to you the whole time. Actually, John, while we were mentoring during the IFA project, alerted me to this reference by Homi Bhabha. The Empire Writes Back. And I really love that as a play on The Empire Strikes Back, that how do you use the same language as the colonizer, to then glitch it, to escape Times New Roman, to mess up justified paragraphs, to, there's big fonts, there's little fonts, there's in every page, there's maybe something missing, there's errors, and it's saying, can we work with errors? What does life look like? Moving through failure as a method as well. The book, in a way, and you know this so well, in a way, any book is an act of rebellion. But for me, even more so,
I think this video has some sound to it. If you could mute the video. Thank you. That is a beautiful sound, I have to admit. But
I do love
a bit of you.
I do love putting percussion onto anything. The book as a form of drumming. I felt in this particular case, actually, the reason why my practice has moved into video and performance and mostly really intangible mediums is because I enjoy that ethereality. I enjoy the present momentariness of it. But in this case, because it was the story of ice that I was telling, and that I had to hold, it had to become an archive. For me, it's playful and it's silly at times, but it feels like a very important gap in the archive because the ice is melting as we speak right now. And this is its voice for me. So it had to be this real life object. It had to be this thing that could last into the future, beyond us. And obviously we're thinking about deep time. So then the reason why there's lines and there's figures sometimes is because maybe even when the language makes no meaning anymore, it can stay in some way.
I mean, it's one of the things that I have realized in experimenting with bookmaking is the power of paper as a form of memory itself. You might have
like the afterlife of a tree.
Exactly. It is the afterlife of the tree. And within that, it begins to contain, the tiny, and you refer to that even in the opening of the logbook, I think, where you talk about how that paper becomes an archive in itself. The logbook is an archive of that which is outside of the text as well. And for me, the book, and I am very attached to the book personally already, but the book became so much more important from that point of view because it is in so many ways that act of resistance. But in that resistance, it also brings to form, it brings to tangible form an act of following intuition as well, an act of letting love become intuition, an act of letting wonder become intuition, an act of curiosity becoming research. And I think you need, in many ways, you need these books to exist so that they become these archives of a parallel reasoning, of an alternative reasoning. And so I was obviously very happy when the book came home, but I was definitely very intrigued by the many elements that play into it. To start with, at the very, very core of it, I think I'd like to get to the center of this world that you've created, if I may, where one side of it, if I am not right, yeah. So you read this part of it, the beginning in one direction, and then the other, you've got to turn the book. You've got to realign yourself before you continue reading the book again. It's kind of like, going to the center of the earth and then choosing to backtrack or start again from the other end. And I was very curious about the decisions that have gone into so much that goes into this book. Like you said, the the use of particular symbology, the use of language in a certain way, text in a particular way. Whether it confuses or resolves is, I think, for one to find out on their own. But if you could talk about the motivations about the book also becoming interdisciplinary in that sense, that would be great.
Mm. I really wanted to create something that felt non-linear and that felt like a choose your own adventure. For me, it was almost an act of democracy. And I know that word is so charged at the moment. It felt like this
Right.
is my way of authoring the book, but not being the authority. And so the way that you can pick and choose and move through the book means you make your own narrative. And perhaps the form and the choices you make ends up being a completely different narrative or conclusion or non-conclusion that you can make. So it felt important to move the center from me to you, and therefore give you back the act of freedom, the act of democracy, and the act of reinterpretation. So in between all of those gaps and lines, you are there. And that's what somehow nature does to us. And I think maybe that's where, that's one of the ideas around climate change, is that listen to it. It's reading you back. You think you're reading it, but it is reading you. And if you read and if you listen, then we'll also know how to be together and coexistent, even within our kind of slightly toxic relationship that we've built with the natural world.
Fairly toxic. I agree with you. And I mean,
and actually, you know, one of the things that, because the book came out during the pandemic, so, and I didn't want to do like a reading on Zoom for like a launch on Zoom for many people. So the way that I did it was have individual people come to me and choose what they wanted to me to read. So it was almost like a kind of a tarot reading. And or they would leave it to me, but I would kind of ask them questions about their energy or their mood or what they needed, and then choose a piece accordingly.
Well, that would be quite an interesting reading of the self, you know, a subconscious way of kind of knowing what's going on with us.
Yeah.
And the idea of also making this an almanac, you know, I think to give it that space where historically certain literature has been, or certain formats of research has been, and then to kind of, you know, inverse that relationship and just say, hey, yes, this is research. It's how I am associating with research. So I thought that was a really good shift. You know, that a lot of people begin to realize only when they're towards the end or fairly deep into their engagement with the book. But while doing all these little interventions, there's also the creation of subcontinentment books, which I know you haven't spoken about much, but I would really like you to talk about that, because I think that's very important to how the book also aligns itself.
Yeah, so I think, you know, the making of the book began in 2018. So subcontinentment weirdly refers to demonetization. There was just so much happening in the world that I was inhabiting in Delhi and around, that it felt impossible to start writing about the poles without taking into account suddenly all the connections that it had to India and around. So I started researching, and there was so many interesting connections. One of them was a teleconnection. It's like a telepathic connection. So the Indian monsoon can be sort of forecasted based on Arctic weather and vice versa. But no one really knows how this this works. Another amazing connection was Bal Gangadhar Tilak's book called The Arctic Home in the Vedas, in which he very strangely posits that the original home of the Vedic Indians, this Aryan origin, was in the Arctic. And in the Vedas, there are passages where they describe the sun moving only along the horizon, which at that point you couldn't have known. So even though it's a very strange book, it sort of destabilizes the current Hindutva mythology, which is that Hindustan is the home, is the kind of stable ground of these particular people. So finding those connections was super interesting to me, and it gave way to this manifesto called Subcontinent. And maybe we don't have so much time to read the whole thing, but I can read some passages from it.
That would be lovely. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think you froze for a tiny moment there, but you're back.
Hello?
Hi, can you hear us? Can you hear me? Yes, you're back. You froze for a tiny moment there.
Oh, okay. Okay. I was just saying maybe I'll read a few passages from Subcontinent. We don't have...
I think that would be nice. Maybe we can have a reading from Subcontinent, and then it'll be nice to also move to questions that people might have.
Yeah, I'll read only like a few sections from it, and I can send it to anyone that wants it afterwards. South Asian futurism does not fantasize a future because it cannot isolate the future from the past. It fantasizes about a life in between. It wishes to grab language by its horns, grab the English language by its horns, and wring it off its yeses and nos and everythings and nothings, and hang it out to dry in the equatorial sun in the middle of infinity. Its locus is entangled, material and spiritual, subliminal and subversive and submissive at once. Bipolar. South Asian futurism is a witness to the ash warmth of the morning when the newspapers have smacked the ironclad gates and a few are lost in trees or transit. South Asian futurism dismisses its title, denouncing South Asia as a universal region without specificity, denouncing futurism as an accomplice to the violence that comes with acceleration. South Asian futurism would like to call itself subcontinentment, a skewed portmanteau of subcontinent and contentment. An idealistic futurism that is scientific but does not believe in science as a solution. Its science fiction does not project a dystopia despite the carbon. It wants an alchemy of knowledges. It wants rumors, humors, hypotheses. It wants ancient imaginaries and everyday erasures. It wants to rest. Where happiness is fleeting, our contentment finds rest. We are the poetry of brown bodies. We take your criticality and raise you immediacy. Subcontinentment says it is a part of and apart from. Subcontinentment says we are one body that is tear gassed over and over again if we are not cautious. The specter of freedom in a world which cannot be reversed but reprinted in the form of 2,000 rupee notes. Purple hearts dreaming of life on Mars, where money will be cosmic and Gandhi will look through lotus-colored glasses and see temples built on tombs. I'm going to skip right to the end. Subcontinentment is anti-extinction. It proposes radical survival, inhabiting the architecture of loopholes. Subcontinent looks up toward the Arctic, where maybe the Vedas found home in the low sun and the early moon, and maybe not. Subcontinent looks downward toward the Antarctic, with whom it shared edges and borders way back when in Pangaea. It finds common fossils, one of them an embossed Ficus religiosa. It finds mica, which shimmers like something far and rare. Subcontinent says, go there, huddle close together, against the wind, pleasure, even at the end. We are opposite like that.
Thank you so much for that, Himali. And thank you for having me here, share some thoughts and ideas. And
Thank you. Such generosity of questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Himali and Anshika. I wish it could go on forever. The rhythm and the poignance of the conversation is as touching as the poems themselves. I realized that hearing you read out the poems for the first time, I realized how important the experience of hearing the poems are. The diligence that you put in designing the book gets into another dimension when you hear the voice. So thank you so much for such a beautiful evening. While thinking about the specificity of the performative element of poetry in terms of voice and rhythm and the pause, you have been as meticulous in the designing of the book, in the choice of materials, as well as the design decisions. So would you like to share a few words about your collaboration with the designer and the choices of materials like the hardbind, which is canvas, and other choices like there's a silver foil inside, and there's gateway paper, and would you like to share your detailing of designing?
Yeah, so I had the amazing gift of Lekha Jandiala, who was a fellow at Khoj, and she was looking for a bit of research to do. And so she was kind of helping me through the stacks of books I had, most of whose titles were just ice. And then I suddenly realized that I can't really work with someone who didn't also understand the voice of the ice itself. And she had, been through the same stories as I had. And so we started working together, and it was a really lovely organic process of going back and forth, disrupting things. She has, she's not this was one of her first design jobs. So it felt like there was this kind of freshness and rawness that we worked with. But the reason that a lot of the decisions were made, actually, one was, of course, to make a really non-linear experience so that it becomes an embodied experience as opposed to something that you read as an other, as a separate object. But it was to make, and I want to try to think about this for my practice in general, and I would encourage so many young artists to think in this way, is how can we make a practice that is very low on impact on the earth? How can we make a practice that genuinely turns off all the lights? It sounds super basic and trite, but the reason why the cover is canvas is because I didn't want to use anything plastic. The reason why we have recycled paper is for that reason. It's and also, of course, paying people the right amount to make the work. Despite COVID, we held on and we continued this, so these kind of fair methods of work are some of the design choices in this. And I want to think about this in everything I make. Can it be, I recently made a piece with ahimsa silk. Can it be a non-violent object in the making?
Sorry, Anshika, you have a question?
No, I mean, I wanted to ask you this and maybe just share another perspective. I think for the amazing power of the book is that it suddenly democratizes the voice so much, right? Uh, it allows for a wider access, and I can say this because Himali has been kind enough to share a copy of the book for our photo book library as well. And so that means that it suddenly is not kind of in these very sacred walls of the gallery or in these very specified moments where one can choose to connect with that language. But to have that book means that this stays with me. It stays with me when I'm reading this on my own. It stays with me when I might have a friend dropping in with her daughter who then might pick up on the book as well. And I think that for me was what was really powerful about this book as well. And yeah, I mean, that's just one small bit that I wanted to add to that.
Yeah, thanks, John. With your permission, one question, Himali, from the time that I've been looking at the book so many times, and I was telling you yesterday how I didn't read the book in a linear way, just went back and forth with it in different ways. I have a couple of questions. One is about this whole idea of ice. You take us very well, and we also read the proposal, so we know how your thought process was before that. You take us through the whole history and politics and the environmental kind of connections with ice and the polar region. I was thinking, how has the material being of the ice, that is the fact that it feels in a certain way on your skin, it's cold, there is a smell, there is a sound that you hear in and around ice that you don't hear anywhere else. So have all these sensory experiences with ice also impacted the way you've written about them, about it?
Yes, because I was so cold the whole time. I'm pretty sure I was more cold than all the white people there. But I think, of course, there was a kind of blank numbness. I thought I was going to be able to write so much while I was there. And of course, it's the overwhelming experience. I couldn't write anything. So it's all in retrospect, thinking back, researching, because my fingers were numb. And that is the ice entering into your body. There was somebody making watercolors on the same residency, and they couldn't do so because the water kept freezing on their palette. So for sure, you're navigating. But then what starts to happen is the materiality of that ice between frozen, solid, liquid, and then literally vapor starts to enter into this book, I hope, with some of the imagery that is both very, very grounded, very material, and then before you know it, you're in complete abstraction and you're lost. And that is kind of the feeling of that fog, the mist, the strange sound. The other thing I'll say is that the book is one of 12 pieces in We Are Opposite like that. So there's videos, there's performances, and I start to use the space blanket, which begins to look like a glacial landscape. It begins to look geological with the way that the light flickers on it. So that, and then maybe another way of thinking of the ice is thinking of communities that are at loss. So I've tried to donate part of the proceeds to an organization in the Himalayas that felt like the next glacier that is of concern to me. Then there was, we offered the book, like the 100 copies to anybody that couldn't afford it. This for me is the thinking with the ice. The kind of feminist methodology of like also trying to embody this material that is so kind of ethereal.
Yeah, and my second question actually was about the fact that as a feminist, as a person with a woman's body as well, did those things impact your work at all? Did gender, sexuality have anything to do with it? Not obvious ways of it, but do you think in any way your identity as a brown person, your identity as an sort of ex-colony se aaya hai kind of person is very evident, right? But are there other identities that also played a part in making this book?
Yeah, there was a certain queerness that I recognized
Mm.
in these changing states of
Yeah.
the ice. And it was literally in these landscapes where, and in some of the videos, you'll see this character of mine is foraging in these rusted ruins.
Yeah.
And the ruins are very funny stories where, like, one Ernest Mansfield mines 50 tons of marble, brings it down to the mainland, the permafrost evaporates, and the marble turns to dust. So there is this character who's kind of just foraging a little bit in these remnants of the failures of like white colonial men. Who she becomes, I have a difficult time pinning down that character. But that character wears a turban, and my father's Sikh, and I have been thinking about like some of these connections between, and he's an explorer, and he went to the Arctic first, went just right after I was born. So there are these kind of connections where I'm wondering, I don't know. I don't want to if I state it somehow, then I pin down that identity. But certainly in that alien character in the videos, you can see that she is struggling with many things. And at some point, she finds identification with the boat. She says, I'm boat.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that feels like the most kind of like feminine way of being in that landscape. On the ice can be I'm glorifying the ice in my dedication. But there were moments where I really hated it. It was so harsh, and it just enters into you, and it's like gashes, and what does that look like? That environmentalism, when that wilderness becomes really wild.
Yeah. It
And
doesn't
it
even
attacks the
pretend to
body.
lie to comfort you, right? It doesn't even pretend to lie to
Yeah.
give any comfort. It's just there. Yeah. So that your book came out during the COVID time. So, and I was wondering that suddenly with COVID, the entire human race has sort of realized that if nature decides, what can it do? And you could be the richest country in the world, and you would be at the same place as the poorest country in the world. In fact, some of the poorer countries were probably better because of immunity, whatever, we don't know. There's not enough science around it to speak yet. But so I was wondering, especially with this project, because you began just before COVID, like in 18, and then of course your journey has been longer. I was like, if Himali was to do this project during or after, if she had experienced COVID and the sort of wild worldwide sort of impact COVID had on the questions we are asking about human nature relationships anew, would there be more? How would that impact? I don't know, but I was very curious to understand. Would it? I know it would, given the kind of artist you are, but if you can say a little bit about what it's made you feel with the book coming out during COVID and you going through the COVID period.
Yeah, and also the delay of the book and how that changed the timeline, within ICE itself. Some of the narratives shifted because I was just sitting there rewriting the book. I feel like it does feel healing to me. And yes, this year has taken on lots of questions of healing in like slightly less cheesy ways than the obvious spa treatment. It's been thinking about the deities of the earth. It's been thinking about our bodies as entangled with the catastrophe of the earth. And how do we recognize that? Realizing that there are ley lines under the earth, which means that the earth kind of has chakras. So, and how can we tap into those things or like realign somehow? I'm working on a new book which is out next week actually, and what I will say is that one of the things that has happened during COVID is, even amid all the frustration and the fiery energy that we've experienced also with all of the protests in Delhi just before COVID, was this feeling that I will experience the grief, the grief of climate change. I will do the work and we will do the work together. But when you're too exhausted to do the work, I'll do it for you. And when I'm too exhausted to do the work, somebody else can do it for me. And we also need to believe in the earth that it has our back. Because the amount of stress I started to feel with the idea of climate change upon me immediately was unbearable. And I wasn't being able to be productive in an activist way. And I think COVID has allowed us to settle down with some of those feelings and be like, you know what, even if we're not here, the thing will continue. Maybe ice won't be there. Maybe like new robotic dinosaurs will form, but something will happen and it has our back. And that's a really nice feeling to be like, we'll do the work and somebody else will support me through it.
Yeah. So a sort of interdependence on a sense of a collective, a sense of being there for each other as well in a much larger way than just your invested relationship, so to say. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Himali. Those were my questions. John, back to
I'd
you.
like to follow up with the question just because you mentioned about Shaheen Bagh. So I was noticing that in your performance, in your reading also, which is quite slow and soft, there are a lot of hard-hitting images and metaphors against the right wing. So that's also about your artistic persona, in which your poetic self is also camouflaging the adventure sports aspect of your practice, which is that of sailing to the polar regions. It can be quite difficult. So would you like to share some epiphanic moments that you had while sailing? And would you like to share about the process of navigation and sailing?
Actually, if I may interrupt this, I also was very curious about one more. When Arundhati was talking, this just kind of came to me in terms of the idea of isolation. You guys were in very extreme temperatures and yet fairly isolated, and to come back from that and to start working on this book, which can be an isolating experience itself, but running parallel to that is an isolation that exists across the planet at that time. So I was curious to know if those moments of isolation triggered changes in thought or perspectives towards how you saw that experience altogether, and how you saw ice, or as an oracle.
Yeah, that's an amazing question. I mean, it just brings into the foreground earthly dramas. If you're stuck on a sailboat with 30 other artists, it's a wild experience. There's lots of mood swings with the waves of the boat. I was also thinking of these movies like Biosphere that came out just when COVID took place, and it was these people who are quarantining in preparation to go to Mars. So certainly there's these we're not in isolation as such, but we're stuck together with certain personalities. And I mean, I don't know if I think it was just about the art of dialogue, like try to listen to this person in a different way, or like see their work through the frozen watercolor. And that's the story. Like they're all trying, everyone's trying to tell a story in a different medium. Yeah, this was me watering the plants during COVID, being like, I can do it. I cannot kill them. And maybe, John, to your epiphanic question, shall I just read a paragraph?
Yeah, sure.
This is called Aurora as Art Writing. And it was this hysterical moment of seeing the Aurora Borealis for the first time and realizing that not knowing was a way of knowing, and realizing that when I looked at images of the aurora before photography, the drawings looked like writing. They looked like symbols. And it started me on this process of language and writing and communication and being with the other as a process of not knowing. I'll just read the small sections because I know we are almost out of time. The sky is called the firmament because it supposedly stays still. Abruptly, we saw this etymology break down. A thin, vaporous green trail, like the kind in early sci-fi movies when everything alien was represented by the color of the poisonous chemical radium, danced above us. We had seen flickers of the aurora borealis from the deck of the tall ship that sailed in and out of Svalbard's fjords, but no one admitted that they couldn't really see it. We made an emergency stop in Ny-Ålesund, a small township on a bay surrounded by a wall of mountains, and without warning, it shook. The stars kept their quiet. The trail twirled in semicircles like a giant helical slinky bouncing of its own volition. There was music too, audible vibration as if wind could play the harp. It was the kind of sound that you hear cutaneously. It touches you, soothes your hair, massages your belly, pinches your cheeks. Eyes dilated and laughter erupted. The town disappeared. The ocean was forgotten. The ship never existed. Real life froze while the slinky slunk. Screams of fear? Or perhaps we needed to test our voices, which were all we had to prove that we were still alive. Our calls were absorbed into the atmosphere. Unmoved, the aurora sounded back. It came in columns like organ pipes, quivering lower and lower. The horizon's precise line blurred, curving so that everything felt a little tilted, and we imagined grabbing the Earth's axis. It smelled like trees, though there weren't any for miles. The scent arrived late, but indelibly. We lay down on a field of ice because we couldn't run from what was happening. If it was going to come for us, we might as well die laughing. There was hysteria. We had, till then, been able to tell a spectacle from the speculative. Now, faced with grand infinity, we reconsidered everything. Only at the end, as the light simmered, we analyzed it. It looked like writing. And then I talk about how actually the earliest form of aurora borealis was seen as low as Iran. And actually the aurora is not this idea of the great north, the white north, that we all experience these moments of not knowing. So just the last paragraph as a conclusion. Like writing, the aurora illuminates the image, asking us to look again, to consider what we see, to hear it and to smell it with a grammar that is both rational and emotional. It presents us with the implausible and says, there is a tongue for this. It wields the power of the abyss, the space of not knowing, where there is a crack in the world, where factuality is suspended. To this, the writer must surrender in order to reimagine the word. This void is space for introspection, a place where a sense of self is obliterated. The I dissolves into the we. This is the point at which a collaboration of different kinds of knowledges might emerge. We operate from the symbiosis of multiple disciplines. Writing can be a place where we relinquish individual ownership or authority over interpretation so that a reader can read between the lines. The aurora cannot be experienced without dilated eyes. The aurora is the act of embracing doubt as a form of critique. It is a rehearsal in total presence, in witnessing the contemporary. It is punctuation. The Northern Lights ask us to view the natural world as one that is constantly moving so that we can be moved by it. It insists on continuing, a semicolon. The sky is not inanimate, it is not firm. It is a sentence ablaze, and we invoke it.
I'd like to ask a follow-up question about some images that comes in the last few lines of the poem, like punctuation and semicolon. So you use punctuation and semicolon and many other punctuations as artistic images. So not only in the book, artist book, where a lot of pages have singular punctuations and constellations of punctuations, but also in a curatorial practice, way back in 2013, a show that you curated in Khoj, which had wall text in the form of punctuations. You created certain rhythms with punctuations throughout the gallery space. So my question is regarding, can we think of your insights into punctuation as a least common factor, the way you balance your life as a visual artist, a poet, and a curator?
What's the least common factor again? I remember it from
The punctuations. Basically, the question is about how your artistic life, which has the letter arts and the visual arts and curating concurrently. So,
I mean, while I recognize that each of these practices requires their own expertise, I also think that for several of the artists that I love and respect, it feels like one merges into the other and it's all one grand big practice. The curatorial is sometimes an excuse to work with wonderful other artists and thinkers. The visual is a way of saying what I can't say in writing, but I still hold that for me, the word, it starts with the word, and the word is the center and the word is the periphery.
quite a revolutionary statement to make in visual arts.
A much needed little book and what in the visual arts space even.
One of the participants has shared that she had a wonderful experience. Sindhu Nagaraj has shared that it was wonderful. It was a wonderful experience listening to you, Himali.
Thank you.
On that note, I wish to thank all the audience members who have joined us today evening to experience this wonderful recitation of poetry as well as conversation. So please join me in thanking Himali Singh Soin and Anshika Varma for such a lovely discussion today evening. And as mentioned earlier, IFA's Arts Practice program is to support artists to take on experimental and unprecedented artistic processes. There are 4 categories under the Arts Practice program, such as productions and explorations, for which the applications are closed for this year. But 2 other categories are still open for applications. They are called Arts Platforms, and secondly, workshops, residencies, seminars, which are open for applications throughout the year. So please visit the IFA website for more details. Now we have invited applications under various categories of Project 560 program, which is a program specific to the city of Bangalore. And the next project showcase will be 2 projects under Arts Education program, which is on November 18th. So looking forward to seeing all of you for the next project showcase. Please follow IFA on social media handles for all updates. Thank you, everyone, and have a great night.
And thank you all. You said yes to this project when no one else believed in it. So very grateful.
Totally our pleasure partnering you, Himali, on this incredible journey. We hope and all the best for all your future journeys. Let us know about the book, the next book. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anshika. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, John and Arundhati. And thank you, Himali. This
Bye.
was a lovely evening.
Bye.
Bye-bye.